They built their chapel on silence, but silence does not stay buried. The Holloways prayed for a lineage blessed by God. Instead, their halls filled with whispers no sermon could drown. Every child born beneath that roof carried the mark of something older than blood. And when the chapel doors closed, no one asked why, because everyone in town already knew. Under the low breath of wind, the Holloway estate seems to hold its silence like a confession. A single stone chapel rises at the edge of the fields, its steeple pulling upward, pale against the dim. The walls are cut from local granite, rough-hewn and enduring. Moss clings to its corners. Its doorway, arched, feels less like an entry and more like a mouth, waiting. The Holloway family did not always command such presence. At the turn of the century, they were simply prosperous farmers, landowners with hands in the soil and contracts with the church. But as the 1800s deepened, something shifted. They began to speak in tones that suggested divine favor. They began to look at themselves not as ordinary believers, but as chosen. And when they built their chapel, they built it not in the town square, but here, on their own land, on their own terms. At first, it was admired. The townsfolk came in carriages and wagons, marveling at the Holloway's gift to God. The stonework was sharper, cleaner than anything in the village church. The wood of the pews gleamed, and from the pulpit, their sermons unfurled like silken ropes. But listen closely to those sermons, and you will hear it. Not simply calls for piety, not simply the standard call to repent, but a fixation on blood, on purity, on lineage. The Holloways spoke of family as if it were a covenant. They spoke of marriage as if it were a sacrament to be protected from corruption. And they spoke of outsiders, those who did not share their faith, their heritage, with words that clung to the ear, sharp and unyielding. At first, the people nodded along. Who doesn't want to be told they are chosen? Who doesn't want to feel above the rot of the world? But as the years passed, their words grew heavier. Their eyes lingered too long on who entered and who sat where. And when baptisms were performed in the Holloway chapel, they did not simply bless the child. They blessed the bloodline. Every name written into their leather-bound registry was treated not as record, but as scripture. It was unsettling, but no one said it aloud. The chapel was beautiful, after all, and the Holloways were generous. They fed the hungry in winter. They gave work to the idle. They even paid for gravestones when poor families could not. But generosity can mask something else. And behind the locked doors of the chapel, the townsfolk began to hear rumors. A flicker of lanterns after midnight, the muffled chant of voices beneath the floor, and the sound, like stone grinding against stone, rising up from the crypt below. The crypt, it was said to be a simple burial chamber, a place where Holloway ancestors lay in rest. Yet no one outside the family was ever permitted inside. The door remained barred, the iron lock polished, the key always carried by the patriarch. And when children played in the fields, they swore they could hear singing drift from its walls. Not hymns, not the psalms of the church. Something slower, lower, almost like a lullaby meant not for comfort, but for control. The Holloways dismissed it all. They smiled at questions. They spoke of reverence, of respect for the dead. But people noticed the way their eyes hardened whenever the crypt was mentioned. And something else. At funerals, when the Holloways presided, they insisted the coffin be lowered not into the town's cemetery, but into the earth beneath their own chapel. Family after family allowed it, eager to please their benefactors. But when decades later, some sought to visit those graves, they found only sealed stone, no markers, no soil disturbed, as if the earth had swallowed everything whole. Still, the town carried on. The Holloways gave, the chapel stood, the sermons continued. But small details lingered in the mind. The way the matriarch's hands trembled as she clutched her rosary, though her voice never wavered in prayer. The way the youngest son stared too long at the congregation, lips moving soundlessly, as though rehearsing a speech no one else could hear. And the way every Holloway child was married not to townsfolk, not to strangers, but to distant cousins brought in from other estates, other lines, each union binding the family tighter, sealing their blood into a circle. Purity, they said, purity above all. The townsfolk pretended not to notice, but behind closed doors, in kitchens and barns, they whispered what was happening in that chapel. Why did the Holloways guard the crypt as if it contained not bones, but secrets? And why? Whenever a storm passed over the valley, did the chapel seem to hum, not with thunder, not with wind, but with something buried too deep to name? The Holloways called themselves protectors of faith. They saw themselves as shepherds of God's chosen. But the people were beginning to wonder. Protectors of what? Chosen for whom? And late at night, when the candles guttered out in the valley lay in shadow, a question stirred that no one dared speak aloud. What if the chapel had never been built for God at all? What if it had been built for them? Under the chapel, the light begins to thin. Stone gives way to shadow, and shadow gives way to silence. The camera lingers on the floor of the Holloway crypt, then drifts lower still, through the mortar, through the blackness, into the place that was never meant to be seen. There was another room, beneath the Holloway chapel, a second chamber. The townsfolk never entered it. Most never even knew it was there, but the Holloways did, and for them, it was the true heart of the estate. At first, the story was nothing more than rumor. A few workmen spotted coming and going at strange hours. Wagons of stone arriving without parish notice. A sound of chisels echoing beneath the floor long after the chapel above had been consecrated. The official records made no mention of it. Not a line in the parish archive. Not a signature in the town hall. No receipts, no contracts, no bills of sale. It was as if the chamber had built itself. But it hadn't. There had been men. And those men did not stay. One was a mason named Dyer, a large, quiet man who had built mills and granaries along the river. His work was known, his reputation sound. But when asked about the Holloway job, he lowered his eyes and muttered only one thing: "I was not paid." He left town that same night, his tools packed in a cart. Neighbors watched the wheel tracks fade into the woods and never saw him again. Another was a younger hand, barely 20, named Colby. He drank too much, talked too loud. At the inn, he was overheard saying the Holloways had cheated him, that he had worked weeks, underground for nothing, that he would see them curse before he ever laid stone for them again. By morning, Colby was gone, his bed at the inn still warm, his wages never claimed. And there was one more, a man no one remembered hiring, no one remembered meeting. He gave no name. He stayed in the town barely 3 weeks. When he left nothing behind, no debts, no tools, no trace. As if the ground itself had swallowed him whole. The chamber remained, hidden, waiting. It lay just beyond the crypt. To the unknowing eye, the wall looked seamless, but there was a stone that was different. Flatter, smoother, pale against the darker granite. Press it and the wall gave way. A concealed door swung inward, and the air changed. Cooler, drier, hollow like the mouth of a cave. The chamber stretched wider than the chapel above, its ceiling arched high, supported by pillars thick as tree trunks. Lanterns hung from iron rings, their light flickering against stone that seemed too polished, too deliberate. But it was a floor that drew the eye. Not dirt, not packed earth, but stone, smooth, cold, gleaming like glass. In the center was a single depression, wide, shallow, carved with channels that spread outward like veins. And though no outsider lingered long enough to study them, the masons knew they were not mistakes. They were not flaws. They were grooves, grooves meant to carry liquid away. The Holloways never admitted it. They never spoke of it in public, but the townsfolk saw the carriages arriving after dusk, entire branches of the family gathering in silence, walking 2 by 2 into the chapel side door. They did not bring prayer books. They did not carry flowers. And they did not come out until dawn. Children who strayed too close swore they heard voices beneath the earth. Not hymns, not sermons, but repetition. A chant, low, measured, relentless. One boy claimed he saw light bleeding from the cracks in the chapel foundation, a dim glow pulsing like coals. When he told his father, he was struck across the mouth and told never to speak of it again. But years later, when that same father worked the field at night. He confessed to hearing it himself. The sound of chairs dragging across stone, of feet pacing in circles. And once, faint muffled applause, the chamber became the heart of the Holloway gatherings. Marriages were not sanctified at the altar above, where light fell through stained glass. They were sealed below, in the stone chamber, with the family gathered around. Births were not announced in the town square. They were whispered underground, with infants carried into the circle and placed at its center before being taken away again. And when death came, when a Holloway was lowered into crypt, the family did not mourn above. They mourned beneath, in silence, in repetition. In that room, a servant spoke of it once. A girl no more than 16, carrying trays of food down the steps. She was warned not to look. She was told to keep her head low, to leave quickly, but she looked anyway. And in that stolen glance, she saw the Holloways seated in a circle, their chairs all turned inward, every eye fixed on the center. She never returned to the estate. Her name vanished from the servant rolls, but her story remained, and it spread. The chamber became legend. Some called it a council room, a place where the Holloways met to settle inheritance and divide land. Others called it a vault, a chamber where wealth was kept, hidden from prying eyes. But a few whispered another word, theater, because when they stood outside the chapel on certain nights, what they heard was not prayer, not mourning. It was performance, voices rising and falling in unison, pauses that seemed too deliberate, a rhythm as though rehearsed. And when the sound stopped, it did not fade. It cut off, all at once, as though someone had signaled the final line. One mason broke his silence years later. Old, bent, half drunk at a roadside tavern. He said the chamber was not built as a crypt. It was built as a sanctum. The grooves on the floor, he said, were cut by design, to let whatever was poured at the center flow outward. That was why he left. Not the darkness, not the secrecy, but the way the Holloways stood watching on the final night, silent, their eyes alight, as if something they had long awaited had finally been completed. He spoke no more after that, and by morning, he too was gone. The chamber remained. The records did not. It does not appear in the parish archive. It does not appear in the town ledger. It does not appear in any estate inventory. But it was there, stone and silence beneath the chapel. And for those who passed the estate at night, there was no mistaking it. The sound of voices, speaking in unison, carried not on the wind, but up from the ground itself. The Holloways gathered there as one, not a family, not a congregation, but something closer, something tighter, a body with a single pulse. And the town began to understand. The chapel above was for God, but the chapel beneath was only for them. The fields are hushed, the chapel dark, its windows holding the last red light of the day, and then the view narrows, pulling closer, to a single shuttered room inside the manor house. It was the spring of 1842. And within those walls, the Holloways welcomed their first child. The boy was born just after midnight. The midwife, an older woman from the village, had been summoned by carriage. She carried her satchel of linens and oils, and though she attended births in cottages and farmhouses all her life, she had never been inside the Holloway home. She would later say that it was the silence that struck her most, the way the house seemed to swallow every sound. She was met at the door by the patriarch himself. He said nothing, only gestured for her to follow. She climbed the staircase, her hands trembling against the polished banister, until she was led into the chamber where the young mother lay. The birth was difficult, long. The walls echoed with low groans, with whispered prayers. And at last, the boy came into the world. He was small, pale, his breath shallow, but there, the Holloways rejoiced. The midwife swaddled him. She pressed his cheek to his mother's chest, and for a brief moment, everything seemed whole, but something wasn't right. On the first night, the midwife remained at the estate. She was given a small cot in the adjoining chamber. She rose at intervals to check the child, to reassure the young mother. But when she entered the room near dawn, she found the boy awake, not crying, not restless, staring, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, his lips moving faintly, though no sound emerged. The midwife whispered prayer. She lifted him, rocked him gently, tried to coax a cry, but none came, only that silent movement of the lips. On the second night, the air in the estate shifted. The midwife awoke to a sound she could not place. It was not weeping, not laughter, not music. It was a rhythm, low, steady, rising from the chapel below. She crept to the window and looked out. Lanterns flickered in the night. Carriages lined the chapel path. The Holloways were gathering. The sound grew louder, carried through the stone, into the bones of the house. A repetition of words she could not understand. The midwife pressed her hands over her ears, but the rhythm continued, drumming against her skull. And then the bell. It tolled once, slow, drawn out, and then again. The midwife knew no one had climbed the tower. No hand had touched the rope, but the bell tolled, and with each strike the child stirred. His lips moved faster now. His eyes flicked beneath their lids, and the midwife began to pray aloud. On the third night, she could bear no more. The boy lay motionless in the cradle, his skin waxen, his breath so faint she could scarcely see it. The Holloways gathered around him, their faces unreadable, their hands clasped not in grief, but in concentration. The midwife pleaded with them. She begged to take the boy, to summon a doctor, to intervene. But no one moved. The chanting resumed, deeper now, vibrating through the floorboards. The child's chest rose once, fell, and then no more. The Holloways did not weep. They did not cry out. They stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the cradle, as though waiting for something unseen. The midwife fled. She left her satchel behind, left her cot unmade. She stumbled down the manor steps and into the road, running until her legs gave out. She never returned, and she never spoke of what she had seen. In the village, rumors spread quickly that the Holloway child had lived only 3 nights, that the midwife had been driven half-mad by what she witnessed. But it was the sound that unsettled the people most. Neighbors swore they heard chanting that night, long after midnight, carried on the air, low and relentless. Some claimed the chapel bell rang 13 times, though no rope was ever touched. And when dawn came, the bell was silent, the chapel door locked, the family withdrawn. The boy's death was not recorded in the parish register. No funeral was held, no marker placed. It was as if he had never been. But the townsfolk remembered. They remembered the sound that carried through the fields. They remembered the tolling of the bell that rang without hands. And they remembered the sight of the midwife, wandering the road barefoot at dawn, her lips moving soundlessly, her eyes wide with something she would never name. From that night on, few entered the Holloway chapel willingly, and fewer still lingered near its doors after dark, because if you stood close, if you pressed your ear against a stone, you could almost hear it. Not crying, not song, not prayer, but a rhythm, steady, measured, like the echo of words spoken once, and spoken again. The Holloways had welcomed their first child, but he lived only 3 nights. And when he was gone, the family did not grieve. They gathered, they watched, and they listened, as though his breath had never truly left the room. The camera lingers on a graveyard in twilight, rows of leaning headstones, grass grown high, yet still thin in patches, as though the soil itself resists renewal. The Holloway family plots are clustered together, stone crosses sinking unevenly into the ground, each one carved with lines of Latin, letters that seemed too sharp, too deliberate, and none of the town's priests would ever admit to writing them, not a single one. The story of the Holloways, by now, had already drifted into unease. Whispers circulated about the chapel, about the strange rites that took place beneath the stone foundations, about the flicker of candlelight from windows that should have been dark. But the pattern only became undeniable when the children came. Every child of the Holloways was baptized, not in the town's parish, where bells rang openly for all to hear, but in the underground sanctum beneath their own chapel, a room no villager had ever stepped foot in, a room that masons had sworn, years earlier, was never meant to exist. It was here, beneath stone and silence, that each Holloway infant was carried within days of birth, wrapped in linens, eyes barely open, skin pale and fragile, and lowered into water that was never blessed by the parish priest, but by someone else, someone within the family, someone whose words were not the words of the church. The ritual, whatever it was, seemed to carry a weight of secrecy that even the servants dared not describe. The villagers noticed the timing, because each time a baptism was whispered about, a sickness soon followed. The children would not thrive, pale skin that never warmed, weak lungs that caught every draft, and fevers that came suddenly, burning through the night. Not one child grew strong enough to walk past the chapel gates. Not one survived long enough to leave a childhood portrait. Every attempt at life ended the same way, with a burial and a gravestone marked by Latin, words that the parish priest swore were not theirs, and that no one else in the village could even translate. But someone carved them, and someone paid for the stone. By now, the Holloways' wealth had grown visibly. Their estate stretched wider, their chapel towered higher, and yet their halls remained curiously silent. No laughter at children, no footsteps chasing across the floors, only solemn processions carrying small coffins toward the family plots. One by one, neighbors began to ask questions, quietly at first, then with a kind of frightened insistence. Why were the Holloway children never baptized at St. Mary's, like every other child in town? Why were the gravestones marked with phrases no one would explain? And why did the priests recoil when asked about them? The answers never came. Not from the church, not from the family, not from the servants who, when pressed, only shook their heads and muttered that some matters were better left untouched. Still, there were those who claimed to have seen things. One midwife, years later, spoke of carrying a child into the Holloway chapel. She said she descended stairs she had never known were there, a stairwell colder than the grave, leading to a chamber lit by too many candles, the air thick with incense that burned her throat, and the sound of a voice, not one but many, chanting words she could not place. When she reached the font, she said the water was not clear, not like the water she had seen in other baptisms. It was darker, almost thick, and the child had cried, not the thin cry of an infant, but something hoarse, guttural, and pained. The midwife fled before the rite ended. She would never set foot in the Holloway estate again. But something wasn't right, because the bell rang that night, the bell of the Holloway chapel, tolling slowly through the darkness, though no hand was ever seen pulling the rope. And with each toll, the town's candles seemed to gutter in their windows, as if something unseen had passed over the streets. The Holloways prospered. They dined. They entertained. They expanded their holdings. But in the graveyard, their lineage told a different story. Infant after infant, small stones clustered too close together, dates too brief to read, without a sting of grief, and always the same Latin inscriptions. Strange, unyielding phrases that seemed to speak not of mourning, but of claiming, as though each grave marked not just a life lost, but a debt collected. The family's silence grew heavier. The villagers learned not to ask, and the priests, who should have spoken, looked away. The Holloways had bound themselves to something beneath their chapel, and whether it was faith or fear or something worse, it was already shaping their legacy. The silence of their halls, the silence of their children, the silence that seemed to reach beyond the family and into the very soil of the town itself, because by then, people swore the air around the Holloway estate no longer sounded alive. No birdsong, no wind through the branches, only the toll of a bell, and the echo of words no one could understand. The inheritance of silence had begun, and it was only going to spread. The chapel walls come into view slowly, not in daylight, but in the dim glow of firelight. The stone glistens as though damp, the air thick with smoke and beeswax. Candles shiver in their holders. Their flames tilt inward, all drawn by something not seen but felt. This is how she remembered it. The servant who lived in the Holloway house. The one who, decades later, could no longer sleep. She confessed only once, and never again. She said the family did not kneel to pray, not like other families, not like other Christians. She said they waited, silent, still, as if listening for someone else to begin, and she swore something always did. At first, it was only pressure, the weight of stone bearing down from above. She felt it in her chest, behind her eyes, a slow ache that grew with each breath, and then the sound came, not a voice, not words, but movement, a stirring against the walls, like stone shifting, like something trying to push through. She remembered the first time clearly, the baptism of a Holloway child. The parents stood at the altar, the infant restless in the cradle of lace, but there were no prayers, no water lifted, no Latin spoken aloud, only silence, until the walls seemed to answer for them. She said the candles bent, each flame bowing in unison, not outward, but inward, toward the altar, as though every light in the chamber leaned forward in reverence, not to God, not to the child, but to the emptiness that filled the room. And she said it pressed closer, a presence without shape, without sound, but undeniable. The stone felt thinner, the air heavier, her knees weakened, her breath caught, and she swore she heard something moving in the silence. Not words, not whispers, but a rhythm, like breath against the walls. She tried to look away, to focus on the baby, but the child was silent too. No cry, no motion, just eyes open wide, staring upward into the shadows above the altar, as if he saw what none of them could. The servant said the Holloways never spoke of these things. They simply turned, one by one, faces calm, hands folded, and left the chamber as though nothing had taken place. But she knew, she had felt it, the weight of it still pressed on her chest. Years passed, children were born, each carried to the underground chapel, each baptized not in the town church, but in silence beneath stone. And each time, the family listened, and each time, something listened back. When she finally spoke of it, her hands trembled. She described the way the walls seemed to inhale, the way the floor seemed to hum beneath her shoes, the way every candle bent like grass in a wind no one else felt. Her words faltered, and then she whispered. It was not God they waited for. After her confession, she withdrew. The others said she hardly ate, that she stopped walking in the garden, that she covered the mirrors in her room. No one saw her in church again. She died within a year. But before she passed, one final sentence was written down by the priest who heard her. He never repeated it aloud, only copied it into his journal. A warning. She said the chapel walls were not holding the house above. They were holding something in. And the ink stopped there. The rest of the page left blank. The priest never returned to the Holloway estate, but he was seen in the years that followed, standing at the edge of his property at night, watching the chapel windows flicker with light, and listening for the toll of a bell that no one ever rang. The camera moved slowly across the treeline, branches heavy with moss, the kind of silence that makes the air seem thick. At the far edge of the wood stands the Holloway estate, its windows dark, its gates rusted shut. By the 1890s, it was already a place apart. The family still lived there, but the town had begun to turn away. Shopkeepers whispered when Holloway men entered their stores. Children crossed the road to avoid the sight of the carriage. Even the priest of St. Bridget's lowered his eyes when passing one of them in the square. It was not hatred, not disgust. It was fear. Something had spread through the valley. Stories told after dusk. In kitchens, in taverns, over fences between neighbors. They said hymns carried from the Holloway woods, but not from human throats. The sound was faint, sometimes like a single voice, other times like a full choir, and yet no one was seen. No gathering, no procession. The melody came without singers, without breath, as though the trees themselves had learned to chant. One farmer swore he heard it while driving his oxen at dusk, a slow, steady song winding through the pines. He left his car in the road and walked toward it, but the closer he moved, the further away it seemed, until he stood at the edge of the Holloway gate. And then it stopped, another time, Children picking berries returned pale and trembling. They said a hymn had risen from the ground beneath their feet, as if the soil itself was carrying sound. The mothers forbade them from going back, and for years afterward, the patch grew untouched. By then, the Holloways themselves had grown withdrawn. They came to town rarely, faces pale, lips tight, eyes that never lingered long. When they spoke, it was in hushed tones. When they bought supplies, it was always in bulk. And when they left, the room felt lighter, as if their absence brought relief. But the most disturbing silence came from the church. For generations, each wealthy family in the county had consecrated their private chapels. It was expected, it was tradition, but not the Holloways. Though their chapel was large, though their family name carried weight, the diocese refused. No document explains why. No letter survives with reasons. But the parish registers are clear. The Holloway chapel was never sanctified. The line is marked only with a dash. A single blank stroke where the date should have been, as if erasure itself was safer than words. When questioned, the bishop at the time offered no reply, only said that the matter was settled, and it was, at least officially. But privately, the priest spoke of unease. One curate admitted that he would not step past the Holloway gate. Another confessed he had heard chanting in the woods on the Feast of All Saints. And one was said to have torn up his own sermon notes after returning from the estate. No one ever explained what he saw. The town took the silence as its answer. By the mid-1890s, few dare approach the estate. Children told stories of black windows that watched them from the trees. Fishermen avoided the river bend closest to grounds. Travelers who asked for directions were warned not to stray near. And still, the hymns continued. Sometimes they carried as far as the town square. Late at night, when the streets were empty, a faint chorus slipping between shutters and rafters, so soft it was almost mistaken for wind. But too steady, too measured, it moved with intention. Families closed their doors more tightly. Candles burned lower, and no one dared repeat the melody. One man tried. He hummed it at the tavern to prove it was nothing, but midway through, his voice cracked, his chest tightened, and he left the building without finishing. He was not seen in town again for 3 days. When he returned, he would not speak of where he had gone. The estate remained quiet on the outside, but those who passed at night told of lights behind the trees. Faint glows, not lanterns, not torches, something steadier, like the dim shine of candles carried through the forest, moving without footsteps. By the end of the century, the Holloways were spoken of only in whispers, not as neighbors, not as kin, but as a warning. Children who misbehaved were told they would be sent up the hill. Teenagers dared one another to stand at the gate after sundown. None stayed longer than a minute. And yet, when records of the town are read today, when registers and deeds and council notes are studied, there's almost nothing written of them, as if the Holloways have been erased not by time, but by choice. The silence was deliberate, and the refusal to consecrate the chapel remains unchallenged. But the hymns never stopped. The camera lingers on a window, high up on the second floor of Holloway House. Its glass is clouded with dust, fractured at one corner, but behind it there is still a glow, dim, steady, the kind of light that seems less like a candle flame and more like something that refuses to die. By 1912, the Holloway estate had decayed into silence. The gardens that once displayed imported roses and sculpted hedges now grew wild with nettle and thorn. The once graveled carriage drive was little more than a track of mud. Roof slates had fallen and shattered like broken teeth, leaving black holes in the upper chambers where rain poured freely into the house. Most of the rooms stood empty, wallpaper peeled down in curled strips. Rodents scuttled behind the skirting boards. Doors that once opened to visiting clergy, merchants, and social callers now remained locked tight against the outside world. But one part of the estate did not collapse. The chapel. It stood apart from the main house, just beyond the overgrown yews. Its stone dark with age and streaked from years of rain. Its bell had not rung in decades. No priest had set foot inside. The local diocese had quietly refused to consecrate it, though no official reason was ever recorded. And yet, in that chapel, one figure remained. Margaret Holloway, the last of her name. She was not a child when the family began to dwindle, nor yet a woman old enough to be considered matriarch. She was caught between those two stations, young enough to be overlooked, but old enough to feel the burden fall upon her. By all accounts, Margaret was plain, thin-faced, eyes that always seemed tired. She wore her hair bound, often hidden beneath a bonnet tied too tightly under the chin. In the village, she was known for walking quickly, speaking little, and paying in coin that looked old even for its time. But what unsettled people most was not how she looked. It was how she seemed to carry silence with her. Children whispered that she smelled not a perfume nor the earth, but a stone, damp, cold, like the inside of a cellar. When she passed, conversations faltered. Even animals seemed to grow wary. Dogs barked and then retreated, pulling at their leads. She kept to herself, and when she was not seen in the village, it was assumed she remained in the chapel. Neighbors, passing along the road, began to hear something there. It began faintly. At first, they thought it was the wind moving through the trees. Then they realized it had rhythm, cadence, words. Margaret prayed, alone, for hours. Her whispers were steady, unbroken, like the thread of a loom pulled endlessly across a frame. People claimed the murmur followed them even after they passed the boundary wall, that it seemed to cling to their ears as though the stone itself had carried her voice outward. One farmer's wife, walking back from the mill, swore she saw light flickering between the cracks of the boarded windows, candles burning steadily, but the flames bent inward, all at the same angle, as though bowing towards something unseen. She told her husband. He refused to walk that road again, but something wasn't right. No one could remember when Margaret last attended Mass in the village. No one had seen her take communion. No one could say if she confessed. It was as though her entire faith had folded inward, consumed by the chapel walls. Inside, her world narrowed to one room. The air was damp. The stones wept with condensation. Moss crept along the flagstones. And yet, every report, every witness who dared peek through, spoke of the same detail. The altar was always spotless, the cloth folded neatly, the candlesticks polished until they gleamed. Margaret herself always kneeling, always whispering. Her lips moved without pause, though no one could ever make out the words. And then came the stories. One boy, barely 14, snuck near the chapel on a dare. He said he saw her through the gap in the boards. Her body was bent unnaturally far forward, her spine curved as though pulled by unseen hands toward the stone. Her hands shook violently, her knuckles white, but her voice did not falter. It never stopped. When the boy told his father, he was beaten for lying, but the boy insisted. She wasn't praying to God, he said. She was praying for something else. The neighbors grew afraid. Some thought Margaret was mad. Others whispered she had inherited a curse that ran to the Holloway line, a madness born of isolation and guilt. Still others believed the family chapel had never been holy ground at all, that the refusal of the diocese to consecrate it had been deliberate. By the summer of 1912, Margaret was completely alone. The last servants had gone. The gardens were wild. The windows shuttered. Even the tradesmen who once brought supplies no longer entered the estate. Instead, packages were left at the gate. Sometimes they were retrieved. Sometimes they rotted where they sat. And yet, the prayers continued. Every night, drifting down the hill, carried on the wind. One villager remembered waking at midnight to the sound of a woman's voice outside his window. He opened the shutters, only to find the street empty, the night utterly still. He swore it was Margaret's voice. But how could he be certain? The Holloway estate was declared officially deserted in the autumn. Notices were posted, but still, no one dared enter the chapel itself. And then she was gone. No one saw Margaret leave. No one witnessed her death. There was no coffin lowered into the Holloway family plot. No marker carved with her name. When neighbors finally forced themselves to approach, they found the house silent. Doors hung open, rooms thick with dust. The kitchen smelled faintly of mildew, but the chapel was undisturbed. The altar cloth was folded precisely. The candles burned down to stubs. The kneeling pads worn almost through, and yet no body, no trace of Margaret. It was as though the woman who had whispered prayers into the stone for years had simply disappeared. And that's when people began to believe something else entirely. Not that she had gone, but that she had given herself. To what, or to whom, no one dared ask. Because even after the chapel stood empty, even after the house was stripped and abandoned, those who walked near the estate swore they could still hear her voice. Low, broken, relentless, praying to no one, praying to nothing, praying still. The ruins lie silent now. But in the winter of 1923, silence was the last thing they held. Snow gathered around the broken stone walls of the Holloway estate. The wind carried to the trees, sharp, dry, whistling like a faint breath between teeth. From a road below, the estate looked like nothing more than a collection of gutted chimneys and blackened frames. But men in long coats and rough boots climbed the slope toward it anyway. They carried nothing holy. They carried barrels. The country was dry now. Prohibition had locked its hand across every town, every parish, every street corner. Yet the thirst never stopped. It only went underground. Men found new ways to move liquor, to store it, to hide it. And the Holloway estate, with its abandoned chapel, its collapsed hall, its forgotten crypt, became one of those places. The bootleggers did not fear it. Not at first. They feared sheriffs. They feared raids. They feared betrayals among their own. But ruined stone, that meant cover. That meant profit. And so, by lantern light, they pushed their barrels into the hollow of the chapel's remains. The floor was half-caved. The roof beams bent inward like broken ribs. But beneath the rot and ash, there was space. And that is where the men worked. One of them, his name lost in reports, known only as a laborer with a scar over his left cheek, kicked against a slab of stone while rolling a barrel. It gave too easily. The earth beneath seemed hollow. At first, they laughed. Another cellar, they thought. Another place to keep the good stuff hidden. But when their lanterns dropped into the crack, the light revealed more than stone. Steps, cut deep into the ground. Narrow, uneven, and black. The bootleggers pried it open further, shoulders heaving against the slab until it slid away. A rush of air escaped the hole. Stale, bitter, carrying with it something like the smell of damp wood and old wax. They lowered themselves, one by one. The first man reported walls, close and pressing. The second noted the carvings. At first, they thought them scratches, perhaps claw marks, or the work of rodents. But as their eyes adjusted and the lantern steadied, scratches became letters. Tiny letters. Row after row. Name after name. Thousands of them. Each etched shallow into the stone, as though by hand, with no more than a nail or a blade. Each crammed into space beside another. The wall packed so tightly that no inch of stone remained free. The bootleggers leaned close, running callous fingers over the lines. But something wasn't right. Not one name belonged to a Holloway. They expected to see the great ancestors of the family, the patriarch, the children, the widow. But the walls told a different story. The names were unfamiliar, untraceable. Many were common: John, Mary, Thomas, but paired with surnames that had no record in town. Some sounded foreign, others impossibly old. And some were just fragments, half names, beginnings, endings, as if they were recorded mid-breath, mid-thought, unfinished. One man spat on the floor. Another crossed himself, muttering under his breath. The scarred laborer counted aloud, whispering as his finger traced them. He stopped when he reached 50, then 100, then 500. His voice faltered. He would not continue. The vault extended further, down a narrow corridor, past the walls of names. The men carried their lanterns deeper. The floor sloped unevenly. The air grew damp, then colder. Drops of water fell from stone into shallow pits. Each sound echoed longer than it should have. And that's when he heard it. A voice. Not from behind, not from ahead, but from within the stone. At first, he told himself it was a trick of the lantern flame, the echo of boots on rock. The the sound of his own breath pushing against his ears. But the others heard it too, a low hum, like a hymn sung without melody, a vibration without tune. The men froze, their barrels set down heavy, sloshing. Their faces turned pale, their eyes wide and darting. One muttered, "It's the Holloways." But the names on the wall said otherwise. They didn't linger long. They dragged the barrels back to the entrance, rolling them with shaking hands. One man swore he felt the walls pressing inward as they passed, as if the stone itself bent slightly toward them. Another said the carvings were deeper now, gouged further, as if written by an invisible hand in the moments they looked away. But none spoke too loudly. They wanted out, above ground. The night had turned colder, the snow heavier, and still, through the ruined rafters of the chapel, the men swore they could hear it. That hum, that voice that was not one, but many. When they returned to town, they told no one. For weeks, they used the vault anyway. Barrels stored among the carved names. Business carried as usual. Money exchanged. But slowly, their number dwindled. One man didn't return from a delivery. Another left for the vault and never came back up. The scarred laborer was last seen kneeling at the entrance, lantern set beside him, lips moving as if in prayer. But the words he whispered belonged to no psalm anyone recognized. When the police finally came, tipped off by rival bootleggers, they expected to find casks of liquor, perhaps men drunk, perhaps armed. Instead, they found the barrels intact, every drop of liquor preserved. But no men. The vault stood open. The names waited. The lanterns still burned. And on the chapel's broken altar above, the snow had gathered in perfect circles, not scattered, not windblown, perfect, as though arranged. The report was thin. The sheriff wrote only what he could explain. Barrels present, men absent, no signs of violence, no tracks in the snow leading away. But something wasn't right. He refused to step into the vault. He ordered it sealed, the stone slab dragged back into place. Yet even then, those who worked the site claimed they heard it. The faint hum, a hymn without tune, names spoken in whispers too small to catch. And in the months that followed, one by one, those workers stopped coming to church. They stopped speaking their own prayers aloud. They claimed quietly that they no longer belonged to the God they once knew. The names had been enough. The walls had taken them. The Holloway estate returned to silence. Snow covered the ground again. The barrels rotted in storage, untouched, until they collapsed on themselves. But in the chapel's lower vault, the stone walls remained same. Thousands of tiny names, and not a single Holloway among them. And that was only the beginning. Their trunks, long stripped of bark by the weather, stand like pale ribs against the night. The ruins of the Holloway chapel rise ahead. A broken skeleton of stone, its walls tilt, cracked, its roof gone, its windows nothing but jagged openings framing a darkening sky. By the 1970s, no one worshipped here. No one had for generations. The Holloway estate was remembered only in fragments, whispered in local taverns, hinted at in county records that few cared to read. But scholars, folklorists, archivists, students of forgotten rituals began to circle back to places like this. The decade had a hunger for the strange, the occult, the rural mystery. And so the Holloway Chapel was remembered again. It began quietly, as these things often do. A grant from a small university. A few eager graduate students with reels of magnetic tape. They drove out on a wet autumn afternoon, the car's headlights cutting through the mist, the air thick with rot and soil. The chapel was already known to the locals as the Hollow House. Some refused to pass it at night. Others swore they saw a pale shape moving near the altar stones. But for the researchers, it was just a ruin, a relic to be documented, cataloged, preserved. They carried their equipment inside. The floor was uneven, layered in dust and shattered plaster. Their shoes scraped across it, stirring up fine clouds that hung like breath in the cold air. A single oak beam, half-burned, still lay across the center aisle, charred black from the fire decades earlier. The lead researcher was a man named Peter Harland, tall, with a gray coat pulled tight against his frame. His eyes moved across the stone walls with clinical interest. He believed places like this held folk residue, cultural memory embedded in the air, the stone, the silence, if one recorded long enough. He argued the land itself might speak, and so they began. They set up their reel-to-reel machine, heavy mechanical, its spools gleaming under the beam of a lantern. The wires trailed across the broken floor, the small microphones, each placed carefully along the pews at the pulpit near the shattered altar rail. The sound of the machine starting was loud in the stillness. A low whir, a steady clicking. The students spoke softly, testing the microphones. Their voices echoed in the empty nave, fading into the broken rafters. Then they fell silent. The recording began. For hours they sat in the chapel. The only sounds were the wind sliding through the broken windows, the occasional drop of rain hitting stone. Once, a bird startled from the beams above, its wings scattering dust as it fled into the dusk. But otherwise, there was nothing. The scholars left that night with little to show, just reels of blank silence, punctuated by the hum of the machine. Still, they returned the following week, and the week after. For nearly a month, they recorded. It was only when they played the tapes back in their lab that the silence broke. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a low vibration beneath their voices, like static or the faint turning of a wheel. But as the reel unwound, the sound grew clearer, a murmur, a texture beneath the room tone. It was not one voice. It was many, dozens, layered so faintly that no one had noticed at first. The students leaned in listening, their brows furrowed. It was not conversation. It was not singing. It was rhythmic, low, intentional. It sounded like prayer, but something wasn't right. One archivist, a woman named Clara Mason, grew pale as she listened. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk. She replayed the section again, adjusting the levels, filtering the background. The murmur resolved. She swore it was forming words, not random syllables, not an echo, a phrase, repeated over and over, overlapping itself like the sound of waves. Her colleagues disagreed. Some heard Latin, others heard nothing at all, but Claire insisted she knew what it said. The phrase was simple. 4 words. Not Holloway, ours. The room fell silent. The others laughed uneasily, shaking their heads. Folklorists were trained to hear patterns where none existed, to stitch meaning into noise. Perhaps that's all it was. But Claire didn't smile. She asked them to listen again, to notice the intonation, the rhythm, the way the voices never overlapped imperfectly, as human voices would, but seemed bound together, pulsing as one. It was not a chorus. It was a single body speaking through many throats. They turned off the tape. The room was heavy with quiet. The next day, Peter and the others returned to the chapel to test again. The air was colder than before, though it was late spring. The grass around the chapel's edges had turned yellow, flattened as if something had lain there. Inside, the microphones were placed in the same positions. The machine clicked, the reels turned, the session began. This time, one of the students whispered that he heard something faint in the moment itself. Not on playback, not imagined. It was a low hum, vibrating through the pews, rising through the stone floor, a feeling more than a sound. And that's when he heard it, the voices. No one else admitted to hearing them at the time. But later, when the tape was played, there they were again, layered, unmistakable. The same phrase. Not Holloway, ours. The words grew louder the longer they recorded, louder than the wind, louder than their own breathing. One night, after a session, Claire refused to re-enter the chapel. She stayed outside in the car, staring at the black windows. She told Peter later that she felt as if the voices weren't being captured from the air. They were being pulled up from below, from beneath the stone, as if the chapel floor itself had a mouth. Peter dismissed it, but he noticed her hands shaking when she touched the tape reels. The final session came in June. The group set up as usual. The night was still. The crickets had gone silent. They began recording. Minutes passed, then hours. The machine hummed steadily. When they left, the tape was nearly full. They carried it back carefully, storing it in its case. None spoke during the drive. Back at the lab, the reel spun. The murmurs began almost immediately this time, but they were not steady. They shifted, grew louder, then quieter. The phrase repeated, but with a sharpness, a force, as though pressing itself against the edges of the medium. The students leaned in, and then, just before the reel ended, every voice cut off at once. The silence was total. For 3 seconds, nothing, and then one final whisper, clear, alone, without echo. Ours. The machine clicked off. No one spoke. Claire excused herself, left the building, and did not return. The tapes remained in the archive for years. Only a few copies were ever made. Some say one was sent to university library, filed under unclassified audio. Others believe Peter kept the originals locked away, refusing to let them circulate. When asked about them decades later, he would only shake his head and mutter, "It was never theirs. It was never Holloway. It was always something else." He refused to explain further. The chapel, meanwhile, continued to stand, weathered, rotting, eroded, but the locals said something had changed since the scholars came. The silence around it was deeper. The birds no longer nested in the rafters. The grass at the edges never regrew. And those who passed it late at night claimed they sometimes heard voices. Not loud, not clear, just a low murmur, as if the stones themselves were still praying. And always repeating the same words. Not Holloway. Ours. The camera lingers on the broken roofline of the Holloway chapel. Stone ribs of ceiling rise against the sky, black against the dim evening light. The forest has crept closer now. Ivy coils into cracks. Roots push through mortar. The building seems less like a ruin and more like a wound that never closed. Inside, dust hangs in shafts of moonlight. The air is dry, heavy, untouched. Only the faint scrape of footsteps disturbs it. They came with cameras. For young explorers. Laughing, whispering. Checking their gear before the stream went live. It was meant to be a joke. A spectacle. Another forgotten ruin broadcasted to strangers behind glowing screens. But something wasn't right. Their first steps echoed too long. The sound didn't stop where it should have. It carried downward, as if the hollow earth below answered back. One of them remarked that the chapel felt too big inside for how small it looked outside. The others laughed, but the words lingered. They carried flashlights, cheap LEDs casting thin cones of light. Every sweep revealed fragments, splintered pews, broken hymnals, scraps of charred wood. The altar was a slab of stone, cracked through its center, as though struck by something far heavier than time. One camera panned across the far wall. It caught the remnants of a fresco, saints painted in ochre, their faces worn smooth. But their hands remained sharp, outstretched, pointing downward. The explorers followed the gesture. The altar hit a stair, narrow, uneven. Leading below, they hesitated, the feed filled with nervous chatter. Hearts and laughing emojis floated across their screens. They descended anyway. The stone walls grew closer with every step. Moisture streaked the surface. The air cooled, and with it, their laughter. One of them whispered, "It smells like matches down here." But no flame burned. The crypt opened suddenly, wide and low. Their lights revealed hundreds of stone niches carved into the walls. Empty, but marked. Each space bore a name, etched with care. Thousands of names. Not one of them Holloway. The explorers brushed their hands across the stone, their fingertips turning white with dust. Their microphones picked up nothing. And that's when they noticed. The chat was gone. The stream still ran, but no messages appeared. The counter viewers froze at 0. Silence pressed in, yet their lips began to move. At first, quietly, like breathing words, unformed sounds. Then clearer, a pattern, a prayer, not one they knew, not one in their language. The cameras showed only static, but the audio persisted. Low voices repeating in unison as if guided. None of them seemed aware they were speaking. The youngest explorer broke first. He dropped his flashlight. It rolled across the floor, beams spinning against the stone, illuminating fragments of faces carved into the wall. Dozens, hundreds, mouths open, silent, He tried to scream, but his mouth filled with grit. He coughed, choked, staggered upward toward the stairs. The others followed, slow at first, as though reluctant to leave. Their lips still moved. Above ground, the stream cut. The cameras fell, still recording. Hours later, police found them, not inside, but just beyond the chapel doors, collapsed on the earth. Their faces were pale. Their mouths were open, their tongues gray with stone dust. The officers who lifted them swore the bodies were lighter than they should have been, as if something had already been taken. One detective returned to the crypt weeks later, against orders. He stood before the walls and traced the carved names with his gloved hand. In the dust, he swore he saw new letters forming, fresh grooves among the old. Names he recognized, not Holloway, but theirs. And that was the last entry in his report, because after that night, no officer set foot in the Holloway chapel again. The doors remained chained, the windows sealed. Yet hikers who pass nearby say they sometimes hear voices. Not loud, not clear, just beneath hearing, like a prayer carried on the wind. A prayer in no language they know. A prayer that waits for someone to answer. They built their chapel on silence, but silence does not stay buried. The Holloways prayed for a lineage blessed by God. Instead, their halls filled with whispers no sermon could drown. Every child born beneath that roof carried the mark of something older than blood. And when the chapel doors closed, no one asked why, because everyone in town already knew.